Chapter 7, The Skin. The majority of persons familiar only in a general way with their physiological structure, are apt to think of the skin as merely an outside covering intended by nature as an armor surrounding the tender tissues underneath, and protecting them from outside irritating and injurious substances and objects. But the skin has several functions, all of which are important, and which are as follows: 1. The protection and covering of the inner parts of the body. 2. The conveying of sensations to the brain, along the nervous system, by means of the senses of feeling, touch, etc. 3. The regulation of the temperature of the body. 4. The excretion of waste products and matter of the system. 5. The absorption of substances presented to its surface. 6. The function of an accessory organ of breathing. This combined functioning renders the skin a valuable ally, and accessory to the bowels, kidneys, lungs, liver, etc., and consequently a very important part of the system. The leading authorities speak of the skin as being a protection from injurious and hurtful substances, both within and without. The skin is composed of two distinct layers, viz. A. The dermis, also known as the cutivirus, or true skin, and 2. The epidermis, or the cuticle, or scarf skin. The dermis, or true skin, is the deeper layer or stratum of the skin, and is composed of a dense mass of net-like meshes, in which lie the muscular fibers, blood and lymphatic vessels, nerve sweat glands, etc., and the hair with its follicles. It rests upon the subcutaneous tissue of the body, in which is contained larger blood vessels, lymphatics, nerves, muscle and fat. The epidermis, or cuticle, lies over the outer surface of the dermis, and consists entirely of cells, being devoid of nerves, blood vessels, etc. The epidermis is constantly discarding or shedding its outer cells in the form of dry flattened scales, new fresh and live cells taking the place of the discarded ones, the supply being kept up by the dermis, which forms these cells and then pushes them upward. These cells of the epidermis grow harder, drier and flatter as they rise to the surface. Not having nerves, the epidermis does not feel pain, and having no blood vessels, it does not bleed when punctured. When you feel the prick of a pin, and the wound bleeds, the epidermis has been pierced and the dermis reached. A surprisingly large number of the scales of the scarf skin, or epidermis, are discarded and cast off every day of one's life. Thousands of these tiny dried cells fall from the body during 24 hours. They are so small that we do not notice them except when they are gathered in quantities. We notice them when they have been gummed on the surface of the body by perspiration, the oils of the system, etc., and then removed when we wash, when they roll off as we apply the wet hand or cloth. Surgeons and nurses who are treating a fractured limb, will tell you that when they remove the plaster cast which has enclosed the limb for a number of days, they will find over a wine glass full of fine powder which has been cast off by the epidermis, the waste cells of which we are speaking. Considering the first named function of the skin, that of a protecting covering of the sensitive tissues beneath, we are struck with the wonderful work of nature in this respect. It is wonderfully soft, and yet equally wonderfully tough. It combines the qualities of silk and leather. It is remarkably flexible, and yet equally remarkably resistant. It repairs itself rapidly, and although constantly casting off matter, it as rapidly replaces it. It is an armor wonderfully adapted to its purposes. Considering the second named function, that of the conveying of sensations to the brain, by the sense of feeling, we find another wonderful adaptation of means to end. A moment's thought will show you that the great variety of sense reports that we receive through the sense of touch and feeling are received through the skin. Millions of sensory nerves terminate in the skin, and it is through these that we feel things. Through them we are made aware that things are hard or soft, rough or smooth, and the quality and character of resistance offered by them. There are tiny spots on our skin which register heat and cold. Some respond only to cold, and some only to heat. Physiology teaches us strange things about these hot spots and cold spots, which however form no part of our present consideration, and we mention the subject but casually in passing. Considering the third named function of the skin, that of a regulating of the temperature of the body, we find that it is beautifully adapted to this work. Its vascular mesh is so extensive that it is capable of drawing to it and holding, in cases of necessity, nearly half of the supply of blood in the entire body, thus protecting the surface of the body from the effects of extreme cold. The reaction, or flow of blood to the surface of the skin, which we notice after taking a cold water plunge, is an evidence of this function. And, at the other extreme, we have the functioning known as perspiration, one of the purposes of which is to keep the body cool in hot weather. By means of evaporation, the average person excretes over 1½ pints of perspiration during 24 hours, the amount being greater in warm weather than in cold. In unusual circumstances such as the case of men working in rolling mills, tending furnaces on board ship, etc., the skin sometimes excretes as much as 2 or 3 pints an hour. Considering the fourth named function of the skin, that of the excretion of the waste products of the system, we find another instance of nature's wonderful work. The waste products of the system are eliminated through the bowels, kidneys, breath and skin. There are myriads of sweat glands in the skin, the number being estimated at about 3 millions or over, the combined length of which has been estimated at about 5 miles. The debris of the system is carried from all parts of the body in the blood, which returns through the veins laden with impurities. A portion of this impurity is burned up in the lungs and exhaled by the breath. Another portion is carried off by means of the kidneys, and a third portion is carried off through the skin, by means of perspiration. When the kidneys are weakened, the skin is called upon to do much of their work. In addition to its own, the water of which the perspiration is composed, is filtered out of the blood in the veins by the tiny sweat glands, which then carry it to the surface of the skin, where it evaporates and is carried away. The perspiration is not noticed to any great extent unless the weather is very warm, or unless we are exercising heartily, in which case it gathers in drops on the skin, and we perceive it. Even then, if the climate be a dry one, we do not notice it very much, as the air takes it up so rapidly, but where it is humid and the air absorbs it but slowly, we notice it very much and find it depressing. When analyzed by a chemist, the perspiration is found to be filled with foul excrement, debris of the system, and waste products, very similar indeed to that excreted as urine. This old matter is poisonous, and nature is making every effort to expel it from the system. Where the colon has been allowed to become obstructed, the perspiration becomes very foul indeed, as it is called upon to eliminate much excrement that should have passed off through the bowels. One readily may see how very important it is to keep the skin in good, clean condition, that it may do this part of its work properly. Cases have been known where the skin of men have been covered with a coat of varnish, in one case a coating of gold leaf being applied to gild a boy for a holiday spectacle, and in every case death ensued. Many contagious diseases are contracted because the channels of excrement are allowed to become clogged and obstructed, and the foul waste matter accumulates and breeds abnormal conditions. This refers particularly to the colon and the skin. Considering the fifth named function of the skin, that of the absorption of substances presented to its surface, we shall not say much at this point. In the chapters relating to the wet sheet pack, and similar treatments, we shall go into the subject of osmosis, in its two phases of exomosis and entomosis, in order to explain the reason lying back of these forms of treatment. We pass by the subject here, in order to avoid useless repetition. Considering the sixth named function of the skin, that of being the accessory organ of breathing, we find that the pores of the skin act in the same general way as do the lungs, although to a minor degree. The pores absorb a small portion of oxygen, and give out a portion of carbonic acid gas. Some authorities have estimated that the skin performs at least 1/50th part of the respiratory function. It is thought probable that the races which go about naked, or partially so, use the skin in this way to a greater extent than do the races which cover the body with clothing, in which latter case nature has adapted herself to the new conditions, and relieves the skin of a portion of this work, thus throwing a greater amount on the lungs. It has been noticed that when the naked races first begin to cover the skin with clothing, many of them sicken and die, this tendency however becoming less after a few generations. In addition to the 6 functions, above named, the skin also performs a function for its own well-being and preservation, in the direction of secreting and using an oily fluid for the purpose of lubricating and preserving the skin and the hair. In a natural state, or when the person is cleanly about the person, this oil accomplishes its purpose and is rubbed off or evaporated from the body. But in unnatural living, and uncleanly habits, this oil has a tendency to accumulate and gum up the surface of the body, also taking to itself the remains of the waste matter excreted by the perspiration, and thus forming an unpleasant, unhealthy and abnormal obstruction and accumulation on the surface of the skin, and more particularly in certain protected parts. A word to the wise should be sufficient.